Hey, this is Seth Parnell, the minister of the Portia Church of Christ, and this is episode 88 of the Midweek Bible Study. We're so glad that you are here tonight to join us for this Bible study. Hope that you are doing well. Hope that you're having a wonderful week so far, and hope that it finishes strong for you. We appreciate you spending your time with us, whether you're watching with us right now or whether you watch it later on. We always appreciate you being here. And we hope this is something that benefits you in a good way. Hope it's something that encourages you and maybe increases your knowledge of the Word of God. As always, we want to extend you an invitation. If you're someone who is in the Portia area, please feel free to stop by and see us sometime. We are right now we are meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning and 6 o'clock for Sunday night and Wednesday night. We are located at 307 South Jackson Street in Portia, Arkansas. And so if you're around our area during church time, please feel free to stop by. We would love to see you. We'd love to be able to worship with you and study with you. It's always good to see a fellow brother and sister in Christ. And so just know that you always have an invitation to join us there at Portia. But also, if you ever have any questions or comments about what we studied tonight, if you ever need, clarification, or if you either need a further elaboration on something that we said, please feel free to get in contact with us. We would love to talk with you about it. We don't want any misunderstandings or anything. So if we can help you to have a better understanding of the Word of God, then we want to do that. And so just know that you have that option available to you. And if you're someone who would like to suggest a passage or a topic for a future episode, then please feel free to do that as well. We would love to we'd love to cover some things that would be of benefit to you. And so if you have one of those suggestions, please feel free to send it my way as well. Tonight we're studying Judges chapters 13 through 16. We're taking a look at the story of Samuel. But with me, I have a guest here, and we have Andrew. He lives in Walcott, and he preaches at Walcott. He's going to be with us tonight, and he is going to join us in the study. I know you're going to enjoy what he has to say, and we appreciate him taking this time to be with us. And so, Andrew, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing?
Yes. First off, I just want to thank you, Seth, for allowing me this opportunity to get on here. I've never done something like this before, so bear with me when it comes to this kind of online Bible study thing. It's all a new genre to me. So I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I am currently a senior Bible major at Crowley's Ridge College. I am the minister going on about 2 years or so. I think it's like this month or next month it'll be 2 years at the Walcott Church of Christ. Yes, I do also live at the congregation, so you can imagine how easy it is to get up out of bed and just start working on Sundays. So got that going for me. And I mean that's pretty much all I can think about me. I think you asked this question. I can't remember if you had asked it or not, but actually, go ahead and ask your question. Sorry.
Oh, we always ask you our guests what they've been studying on or what they've been teaching on lately.
Yeah. Sorry. I was getting ahead of myself. Yeah. So when you ask the question, what have you been studying about lately? It's kind of a loaded question,
Mm-hmm.
for a guy like me, because I do all the lessons, I do all the classes, all the preaching, all the things like that. Last Wednesday, we went over Luke chapter 4, where Jesus is tempted, and talked about that and drew some parallels of how we can resist temptation. And then this past Sunday, and for several Sundays, I've been doing a study on the letter of First Corinthians. I've been looking at that, kind of comparing how our church can be, the issues that church had, and the things we can learn from them, and so forth.
That sounds like some good lessons. And then we know if you went to CRC, that's where I went, and that's one of the best schools in the area. And so we know you get a good education down there. Well, we've had a couple people chime in already. We've got Tom and Billy Gale. They are here. They're enjoying it so far. We appreciate you guys being here. They're always big supporters of what we do. And also we got Crystal Hudson. She says hello and welcome to me and to you as well, Andrew. And so it's good to have you guys as well. And I hope that things are going well for you. But Andrew, tonight, as we said, we are taking a look at Judges chapters 13 through 16, the story of Samson. One of those stories that stands out in the Bible because of the quality or the nature of the story itself. Samson is one of those figures that has almost like a superhero quality to him, with the gifts that he's given by God. He's someone who had incredible strength. He had strength that was well beyond what any normal human being is capable of. And so, with that kind of dynamic nature of that gift that he's given, this is a story that we remember in the Old Testament. And he's someone that is often told. Sometimes it's told in Sunday school classes, and sometimes I know I've preached a couple sermons on it, but it's something that it's a pretty well known story in the Old Testament about a judge, about a man by the name of Samson who had this spectacular gift. And so when you read this story, and when you think about what we read there in these chapters in Judges, what are your first thoughts or your first impressions when you read about the story of Samson?
Well, for me, I think the first thing that always comes to mind is the whole superhero aspect. Me as the guy who would watch superhero movies and all that growing up. I always like to identify with a character like this. This is pretty much in biblical terms as close as we get to somebody like Superman. Being able to kill 1,000 Philistines single-handedly and being able to do the feats of strength. It's pretty spectacular. I think one thing that I also see coming from this section of scripture is just how we see a dynamic of God that is shown sometimes, but it's not something we often think about. Specifically, the dynamic of God and how he can use people even if they're disobedient to them. In Samson's case, to an extreme extent. And that's something we really see in the story of Samuel. I did what you did earlier. Samson. It just brings this whole dynamic about God that I don't think we tend to think about a lot.
Yeah, that's one of the bigger aspects of the story, because when you think of him in that like you said, in that dynamic way with that superhero quality, he was also someone that was very, very imperfect. He had a lot of flaws. He had a lot of problems,
and when we compare it to this typical superhero formula, somebody like Superman, for instance. We typically think, oh yeah, maybe they have flaws, but they're good people, right? They do what's right. They fight for justice. But Samson, in a lot of cases in this story, that's not really the case.
Yeah, he's someone who messes up, and then he does it again, and then he does it again. Like he's someone who doesn't seem to learn from his mistakes, but he's definitely someone who was given a lot, and then he kind of balances what he has with some of the flaws in his character. But when we take a look at the man himself, at the main character, this man Samson, who, if you were trying to introduce, if you were trying to tell about maybe the person that this man is and how he fits into the story. Who is Samson? What are some things that we should know about him in order to or understand the story that we read here?
Well, I know a question that's going to come up later is what kind of world is Samson living in? Um, you can't really answer the question, who is Samson, without explaining that a little bit. Samson is what we know would be to be the 12th judge, I believe, in the story of Judges. If you know the story of Judges, none of this is new to you, but basically the gist of it is the people of Israel go into idolatry, and then God, in being the jealous God that he is, punishes Israel for their rebellion. And then after a certain point of being put in captivity, of going through a lot of bad things, Israel realizes, maybe we should have obeyed God. And then they come back to God. They pray to God and pray, God, please deliver us from this, and we'll come back to the fold, and we'll begin to be obedient once again. And so God, as the merciful God that he is, which again, I think shows the character of God, knowing that these people within a generation or two are going to go right back to where they were, is merciful to them and will send a deliverer. And that was in the form of a judge. And then you have this cycle over and over and over again, where another generation would rise up. They go back into idolatry, yada, 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 circle and circle. But Samson, in particular, is the last of these judges, if I remember correctly. And it's at his death that the whole judges cycle seems to end. Samson and the life of Samson happens about 50 years before King Saul comes around. So this is basically the wrapping up of the story of Judges. The interesting thing about Samson specifically is the majority of judges, to understand what a judge is, it was a leader of some sorts for the purpose of leading Israel out of their captivity. And the majority of those cases, we see militant leaders. We see people who gather together the people of Israel and would have the force of men and soldiers to be able to rise against the armies that were fighting them, and the nations that had kept them under captivity. But the interesting thing about Samson is we don't really see that with him. He's not really he doesn't have any leadership characteristics, really. He really is an army unto himself. He's a one-man army that is blessed with strength beyond anything that any other character in the Bible we can compare it to, or anybody we would know in real life for that matter. Not to say the Bible isn't real life, but you know what I mean by saying that.
Yeah.
The life that we're more familiar with. But Samson, he really wasn't a military leader. He really didn't lead Israel at all. He just went and killed a bunch of Philistines. And as verse, what was it? In chapter 13, as verse, if I can find the verse, as verse, where is it? I didn't think I'd have to bring this up, so that's what I did. In verse chapter 5 of Judges chapter 13, we read that the angel who approaches Samson's mom explains the purpose of what Samson's going to be, being the one who will begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. We know that he didn't totally save Israel, because even in the days of Saul and David and even Solomon, the Philistines were still around, and the Philistines were still a threat and caused a lot of problems. But we see the purpose of Samson was to be a judge that would begin to start this crusade against them, essentially.
Yeah, and these the story of who Samson is and the world that he lived in is something that kind of blends in together. But we know that he was of the tribe of Dan, and he was someone who he had even at the very beginning of his story, how he came to be and how he was. His birth is a story that's given a lot of attention in Judges 13.
which is not something that happens at all in Judges.
Yeah.
Samson really is like the only judge that's given this much spotlight. There's a lot of judges that aren't even a full chapter, but Samson gets like, what is it, like three chapters?
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at just the passages above, in chapter 12, we'll find, I think it's like three judges that are all grouped together, and we just have basically a mention of their name and a little bit about what they did,
and how long they judged, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's all. And then we get to Samson, and we have a narrative of almost 3 chapters, and he was someone who was definitely, he's like we said before, he's very unique in a lot of ways. And like you said, there's a portion in the story when the Philistines come to raid Israel because of some of the chaos that Samson has been sowing, and about 3,000 of the Israelites come to Samson and bind him up. They don't want to attack him, but they bind him up in order to deliver him to the Philistines, and which is not something you see would happen with any of the other judges. But people, like you said, people like Gideon, people like Deborah and Jephthah, they were all people who led armies for the purpose of deliverance. And even though it says that Samson judged Israel, I think for about 20 years, he never was someone who led in that capacity. That just wasn't someone that he was. But he was someone who was, I said, he was given a purpose. He was given the angel said that he's going to have a purpose for his life. He's going to have a thing to accomplish. And because of that, he was given his mom was given some special instructions on what to do and how to raise him and of sorts. And he was going to have part of the Nazirite vow that they had at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, that's another important thing to mention in this story. A very identifying trait of Samson was that what I don't even know how to explain it. You can't say he took it because it wasn't his choice. He was under the Nazirite vow, I guess would be a good way to explain it. From the day he was born to the day he died, as the passage says, he was under the Nazirite vow. And I think it would do good to just quickly explain what that is. Basically, the Nazirite vow is 3 things. It's 3 things that you cannot do, and Jews, they had a lot of laws. Jews, they had all the Levitical laws, the things that were unclean to eat, the traditions that you had to follow, all those things. But there was a certain thing that you could choose to take to put yourself more in line with God, and that was the Nazirite vow. These 3 things were do not drink or partake of anything that is of the vine. So he couldn't eat grapes or things like that, but that it really more preferred to the consumption of alcohol, because you can't have alcohol without grapes in that day, or of any fruit that comes from a vine for that matter. And then you also couldn't, you couldn't touch the dead. You couldn't have anything to do with dead things, specifically touching them. And then thirdly, which is the one that pertains probably the most to our story, is you cannot have a razor cut your hair. You cannot have anything cut your hair. You can never have anything cut your hair throughout this vow. And so when you've made this vow, it's like you've committed yourself more to God by having it. And it's interesting because this angel of the Lord that comes to Samson's mom says that you're going to have a son, and that for him to fulfill this thing, he must do these 3 things. He must be one of the Nazirite vow, which ironically, spoiler alert, he probably, there's a lot of scholars that say he definitely broke all 3. It's one of those kind of, we assume with culture and all that, but we know that he broke 2 of those things. Yeah. And we have a pretty safe assumption that he also broke a 3rd as well. So this guy, this judge and this man on behalf of God, single-handedly breaks every rule on top of several of the 10 Commandments and several other Jewish laws. Manages to break all of those, pretty ironically.
Yeah, he does. And like I said, he's sometimes I think of him in the same camp as people such as Jonah,
Mm-hmm.
who were used for God's purpose, and yet they're not really a model or
Yeah, they're
an
not great
example
people.
to follow. If you were wanting to emulate the character of someone, you wouldn't pick Samson or Jonah to do that. But yeah, there's some big things that they accomplish. But is there anything else that you might bring to the table about the world in which they lived in, and which Israel was, and some of the things that they faced as a nation at this time?
I mean, I think that's pretty much the gist of it. Philistines had pretty much taken over at this point, to the point where, I mean, they had taken over everything. I mean, they were about as oppressive as you can get. Um, just for the sake of context, I mean, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, I think it's chapter maybe chapter 15. It says that. Well, I think maybe chapter 15. I'll have to check, or maybe 14. But it says that the Philistines had been ruling over them for about 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
and so this had been a problem that had been persisted for quite a while. And just like some of the other judges, sometimes they would be allowed to be oppressed, allowed to be ruled over for a sometimes a pretty lengthy amount of time. And this
Mm-hmm.
was one of those times as well. And as we know, in future stories with like Saul and with David and with them, they have a lot of problems with the Philistines as well. And so, over a long period of time in Israel's history, the Philistines are a pretty major thorn in their side. And and so this is just one more episode of the Israelites kind of going against them. And as we also mentioned, this took place in the time of the judges, so there's no king. It's a often referred to as a pretty chaotic time in Israel's history, and so they're just kind of surviving. They're just kind of at least it seems at times just trying to kind of treading water, is trying to get on to survive this oppression by the Philistines before God sends a deliverer to them. But it also speaks about the spiritual condition of Israel at this time, and it says that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, that cycle that they went through, and this is the point in the cycle in which they were not a very righteous people. They were people that did a lot of negative things, a lot of sinful things, and this was the as a result of that they were facing this oppression, and so
Which, talking about Samson, that's cool wallpaper, by the way.
oh, thank you.
Talking about Samson, uh, Samson, I believe, 'cause, you see in the Old Testament, especially, you see it kind of in the New Testament too, but you see in the Old Testament, a lot of characters are representations of certain things. And so, you take the story of Jonah, for instance. Jonah is a very real representation of Israel and how they looked at other nations and how they showed just absolutely no mercy to any other nations whatsoever. Um, and I think Samson fills that role as well. I mean, maybe it's a little bit reading between the lines, but I've always seen the story of Samson as, despite Samson being someone who was very unfaithful, despite him being someone who continually broke the laws that God had put in his life, he was still going to be used for God's purposes, which is
Mhm.
exactly what happens with Israel. Despite them, I mean, even in this particular story, despite them rebelling again and again and again and again, they're still the nation that's going to bring about the purposes of God. They're still the nation that's going to bring about Christ. They're still the nation that's going to bring about the church, the kingdom, as well as other things that were all part of God's plan. And so to identify the character of Samson is to identify Israel and what he represented.
I think that's a great point. He's kind of like you said, an image, kind of a like you said, a representation of the nation as a whole, and that is a that can be an important thing to look at. We've had some other people join in here. We've had Pat McIntyre. The McIntyres are watching. It's good to have you guys here, and I hope you are feeling better. We got the Tillmans from Ravenden. It's good to have you guys here. Hope things are going good up your way. And we've got Nancy Medlock. She is here as well. We wish you the best. Hope things are going good for you as well. But even though we know that Samson had a lot of flaws, he had a lot of a lot of problems in his life. He also had some good things as well.
Mm.
There's some positives that you can take out of the man, Samson, and what he did in the story that we find. And there's some things that we can look at. There's some things that we can take from his story that are good and that can benefit us in some way. And so, what are some good qualities or good characteristics that you can take from Samson's story? You can take from the adventure that we read there in Judges.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just the sheer confidence in Samson. I mean, you can't read this story and not see the just absolute confidence in everything Samson does. And I mean, to be honest, it really is one of the few good qualities about the guy, and just how much confidence he had in God. Because Samson knew that none of the things that he was doing was normal. I mean, he knew that none of the strength and the feats that he was able to accomplish, he knew that no normal human being could ever do those things. And so when it comes to the secret of him breaking the Nazirite vow of cutting his hair and removing his strength, things of that nature, he understands the commitment of following God, and he understands that God, it was God's strength, it was God's spirit. In fact, we even see in a couple of occasions in the story where he straight up calls upon the Spirit of God.
Mm-hmm.
He understands that spirit and that blessing is required for those things. And so if you were to look at the positive qualities, things that we could take away, just in an absolute reliance of God is pretty important, I think. I mean, I know I, for one, am not going to go into a field of 1,000 Philistines and think I'm ever going to come out alive. I mean, I'd run the other way if I ever heard about something like that.
Absolutely. He was someone like you can definitely say if there's any Bible character that had, confidence, maybe to the point of arrogance at times,
It was him, yeah.
This was him. Never do we read about the doubts of Samson. Never do we read about him, questioning whether he can do like a certain feat. It just says he got up and he did it. And whether it was taking on, 1,000 Philistines or carrying the gates of a city to the top of the hill, that's that's what he did. He had that confidence about it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even at the end where you see his eyes have been gouged out and he's leaning against two pillars. I mean, even then, obviously we don't see it as a command, but we see it as a plea to God, saying, God, give me the strength and I will die with these Philistines, even to the very end in this pretty hopeless situation. I think he still understands the power of God. He still understands the reliance on God, and we see that pay off for him.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two major things when I was studying this that I kind of zeroed in on, and one of which is that, as you mentioned, he was someone who was reliant on God, but we also know that he had a lot of failures. He had a lot of flaws at times, but he didn't let those failures push him away from God or keep him from from calling upon God. He was
Mhm.
someone, like, even in his last moments, when he has come face to face with the consequences of his mistakes, because his sight is gone. He is captured, by the enemies. His choices, his mistakes have led him to this position, but yet he still calls upon God. He still says, like you said, he says to God, give me strength. And it's an important lesson, for us to understand. Sometimes people kind of get that, that mentality in their mind, and they think, well, if I've done too much in order to be able to talk to God, or if I've done too much to be able to be useful, to God. But I think Samson is an example that is simply, not the case.
Mhm.
That God doesn't keep score like we do.
Mhm.
And
I mean, I think it goes exactly to what Jesus said about having the faith of a mustard seed, right?
mhm.
Even something as small as that, I mean, can move mountains. And with the case of Samson, it's a very literal application there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think that's big for us to to understand. Even people like the Apostle Paul and others who had a lot of regrets, you might think, in their life. They still were able to be reliant on God, and that's one thing that we can understand.
Hmm.
Another thing that I thought was thinking on was that he took, what he was given. Like you said, he didn't. We don't have any cases where he asked you for this gift or for the strength, but this was a purpose that was given to him. When he was born, and so he used what he had, and even though he made a lot of mistakes, he fulfilled the purpose of God with
Hmm.
the abilities that was given to him. He used what he had in order to complete God's purpose. Because
Hmm.
it says in the story that um, God was wanting to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He was seeking an opportunity, to lift off that yoke of oppression, and Samson was going to be the tool that he was going to use, for that.
Hmm.
And he used what he had in order to fulfill, God's purpose. He didn't have maybe the leadership qualities, of Gideon and Deborah. He didn't have some of the wisdom, of people such as Solomon. But yet he was someone who used, he used what he had. And I think
Hmm.
that's another great lesson, for us.
Well, and
Sometimes.
it's important for us to realize, that there was nothing like that has ever happened before. I mean, there's not been
Mhm,
a judge, there's not been a character. I mean, you can make an argument about the mighty men of David later on, but I mean, that's way after Samson.
mhm,
Never before has there ever been a one-man army in the Bible. I mean, anytime, you look at the conquering of Canaan, it was always an army. You
mhm,
look at the story, it was always an army. It was always a bunch. So the idea that one man, this was something very unique to Samson. But I think
mhm,
you're absolutely right. He takes it upon himself to fulfill that to fulfill that purpose anyway. To not care about the logistics of the situation, to not worry about the doubts that he may have because of past history of, well, we
mhm.
always have had this, so I must not be able. He went out and just did it anyway.
Yeah, and yeah, he couldn't look back in history and say, well, that person had supernatural strength. I'm just going to follow his lead and do
Yeah,
what
no,
he
it
did.
really was just him. Yeah.
He was in a truly unique situation, and
Hmm.
he did what he could. But as we know, he had a lot of good things about him, and as we've mentioned frequently, he also had his flaws and his problems as well, which is a big part of his story and a big part in how his story plays out. And so, if you could maybe highlight what are some of the problems and flaws that Samson faced during his time as a judge of Israel.
Well, I think that the first flaw, and probably the main flaw that leads to his downfall, um, and I don't know, I don't know the way to explain this without being slightly offensive, but it's the fact that he couldn't handle not getting what he wanted when it came to women. And one thing that's important to realize, and I know there's a lot of people that get offended at this kind of talk, but it's important to realize that the culture in that day was drastically different from how it is today. The New Testament culture, it's pretty far removed from how we would think of today, in Roman society and all that. But there's a similarity or two when it comes to certain things. When it comes to the Hebrew era, when it comes to the era of the Old Testament, era of the Judges, I mean, you have to understand, like, times were so much different back then. The idea of how women were looked at. I know this will sound terrible, but I mean, women were pretty much thought of as property. Like, if you were to have your household, the things you owned, your wife and your kids were a part of that. If you were to lose, and it was just all this package deal. And I know that sounds terrible, but it's not as bad as it sounds. It's just the way they thought of things back then. And so the practice of your parents arranging a marriage, that's just what happened everywhere. I mean, that was a very, very common thing. And so we see at the beginning of the story, in chapter 14, where Samson sees a daughter of the Philistines, one of the uncircumcised, non-Jewish people. And he demands from his father and mother, I must have that woman, which is already breaking one of the rules of the Old Testament. It's already breaking one of the Jewish laws, because your parents were supposed to decide who you married. The idea of picking someone who you married, especially picking someone of the enemy, picking someone of a foreign land, that's like 2 or 3 laws that are instantly broken right there. He's not honoring his father and mother by, demanding something of them like this. He's not upholding the laws when it typically comes to marriage, because he's marrying a Philistine woman. And he's foregoing the whole tradition of having your father and mother set that up in the first place. So we see, and this is why I make the parallel to the people of Israel. We see here where it says basically his father, after Samson comes and tells his father, I have to have that woman over there. We see in verse 3 of chapter 14 where it says, but his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all your people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. That whole idea of being right in your own eyes, there's another place in the Bible, a very unfortunate time in the Bible, where we see that exact same language used, and that's in Genesis, where it talks about the world before the flood. And what exactly does it say about the people there? It says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That was the main issue. I mean, sure, there was evil going on. I mean, the passage even mentions that. But the first thing that's said about that particular group of people is they did what was right in their own eyes. And so when it comes to Samson, a very unfortunate quality about him is the fact that he was a selfish guy. He was very, very selfish, especially when it came to that of women. So the reason that he has a lot of the problems he has is because he is essentially doing what he wants rather than what God wants, rather than what his parents would want in the situation. So that's the first real, and I think that it pretty much covers all the unfortunate qualities. There's a little bit more I'll go into here in a second. That's the first and the most broad quality that really does hurt Samson when it comes to him potentially being a role model. We see that happening in a couple different times, in times where, you take the lion that was dead, that had honey inside of it. from a bunch of bees swarming. You see later on in the story where he leaves his wife and his wife goes to one of his companions. We see another time where he's selfish and he wants to prove something to his friends, and since he couldn't hold up his end of the bargain, he goes and kills some Philistines for the sake of holding up his end of the bargain. We see that a lot. So Samson, just like the people of Israel at the time, chose what was right in his own eyes. And in doing that, he broke several laws. In the case of the lion with the honey, he broke one of the laws of the vow of the Nazarene, which was don't touch dead things. So he does that and breaks one. He also probably breaks a second one because also in let me see here. I believe it's chapter 14 verse 10. We read his father went down to the woman and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. When it comes to feast, specifically wedding feast, and that mentioned for so the young men used to do, understand that this is not a guarantee because we weren't there, and this is just one of those things scholars debate. But when it comes to that type of language, drinking was probably involved, and a lot of drinking was probably involved. And it's pretty hard to say. I mean, you look at the other weddings we see in Scripture, the very wedding Jesus went to where he does his very first miracle. What is it? It's turning water into wine. Being at weddings and a feast at a wedding, I mean, alcohol was involved. Understand that doesn't necessarily mean, excuse me, 100% that he partook of it, but just with the language and the what we've seen out of Samson to this point, he probably partook of it. So that's the second Nazirite vow oath that's been broken, and as well as many other things. So selfishness is very predominant when it comes to the life of Samson.
Yeah, when you see his character, like you said, it's hard to imagine like he refrained from those types of things, because self-control is not something that you would use to describe.
It's not a quality that we see from him. No,
it's not something that he promotes. And I always kind of thought of it in the terms of he was someone that was very, very easily distracted. He was someone who was distracted. Of the other things in this world, like we know that he picks this like you mentioned, he picks this Philistine woman as his wife, and that doesn't turn out. We know that later on in the story, he visits a prostitute, and he's involved with her for a short time, and then we see he's involved with Delilah at the end of the story. And so it's something that even though it's only, like I said, it's only 3 chapters long, it's a reoccurring problem that Samson has that distracts him from where he needs to be.
By the way, Samson also breaks another law because we mentioned earlier that his first wife went to what the Scripture says is his best man, which would have just been a friend of his. You could make an argument for that not technically being his fault, because Samson had gone away and he had come back, and because he was away for a while, his father figured, well, as was common in society that day, my son is gone. It's my responsibility to do something with his wife. So he gives her over to his companion. Which you could argue, whatever. Samson, that wasn't necessarily his fault. But Samson gets back, and while he does seem to have a little bit of a problem with it, ultimately nothing changes. Ultimately, he doesn't do anything against the relationship, which again is breaking more laws when it comes to the Jewish law, because that's not how that works. you only separate from your husband or you separate from your wife when one of them dies, or if, in the case of adultery and all that. And so it was completely unlawful for that to happen in that particular context. And Samson was just okay with it.
Yeah, in the terms of relationships, yeah, Samson is another negative strike against his character. He's not an example of that as well. But I mean, we can also take a look at, we know that even though God used him for who he was oftentimes a very vengeful person. He was someone who sometimes his focus was on getting revenge, on striking back at the people who had wronged him, and that was even though that was directed in in the overall picture for a good way, it's still not something that is a positive quality. It's not something that is generally good for us to follow. And
sorry, go if you were saying something, go ahead and finish it.
You go ahead.
Okay. One more thing I'd say, as regarding the qualities of Samson, I think depending on your perspective on the story, you can call this a positive or a negative, honestly. In a positive note, Samson had a lot of patience when it came to his women. When it came to his wife, I remember just in preparation for this particular story, just constantly asking myself, Samson, how in the world, this is the fourth time that your wife has tried to kill you, and you're just okay with it. So on one hand, you can think of it as a positive. He was merciful. He was patient. He would just deal with his wife, or maybe his wife was just really cunning and would persuade him. You're mocking me by doing this. Well, if you really love me, you do. How a woman like that can be. In a negative quality, though, Jesus tells his disciples, what was it, to be gentle as sheep, but to be as crafty as, was it serpents? I believe is how, yeah. We as people of God, while we understand that we should be merciful, we should be gentle, we should be patient, there's a certain point that we need to be crafty enough to pick up on things. And so while, yes, you could say that he was patient, if you look at it a certain way, there's a certain level of, why aren't you figuring this out? There's a certain level of self-awareness, or a lack of self-awareness, that Samson seemed to have. So that's another, to me, if I was to explain this to someone, I'd count that a point against him, honestly.
Yeah, he was definitely not a good judge of character. If you think about him, with the choices that he made, and like you said, with that self-awareness, we know that Delilah was bribed by the lords of the Philistines for I think it's 5,500 pieces of silver in total, and they each gave her 1,100 a piece, and which I've read widely different estimations of how much that would be in our day. Some say that it was around around $8,000. Some say it was up to 1 million, which I don't think it's that high.
Probably not, no.
But there's a lot of variance in the type and how much it was. But
whatever the case, you have to look at it first, though. Both of his wives were Philistine. That is not a very good judge of character to begin with. I see them as right. And while, this could be reading between the lines, but just with the character that we've established with Samson and what we've seen out of him, it's probably pretty safe to say that he judged more of appearance than actual character. Because, yes, the Philistines did offer his wife money. But at the end of the day, someone who's truly worth loving, someone who's truly worth being with for the rest of your life, is not going to accept an amount of money to have you killed. Maybe I don't know, maybe there's some crazy stories, some husbands who've been with their wives for a long time, could tell us all, my wife, but at the same time, like, realistically looking at this, like, you picked a pretty bad wife, or you're continuing to be with a pretty bad wife. And usually when it comes to that, especially when it comes to men, we judge looks rather than character.
Mm-hmm.
And we men, I mean, truthfully, have a really, really bad habit of doing that, of seeing a pretty woman, and I mean, I know me personally, I know we'll get into the application here in a minute, but I'll just talk about it right now because it leads into this. We men always have a tendency to put looks over a lot of things, because I know even in my limited life experience of, being homeschooled and, only being 22 years old, I know several guys who are willing to be with, and even marry on a couple of occasions, some women who are just, they got a lot of problems just because of their looks, just because
Mm-hmm.
of how attractive they are. And I don't think women are quite as prone to that. Maybe there's a certain level, but men especially. I mean, once we see a pretty girl, everything, all common sense goes out the window. And with Samson, that's probably what happened.
Yeah, the spiritual aspect of it was something that was nowhere near Samson's concern. At least it
Mm-hmm.
seems, especially when he was when he was choosing the women that he spent his time around. The spiritual influence, the compatibility with that was, he was concerned with nothing of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, it appears that the only thing that he was concerned with was the outward appearance, and that led to some pretty serious consequences for him. But and but we've been going for about, let's see, about 53 minutes here, and so we're going to try to wind down our story here. And but we know that this is something that has uh, we know we speak a lot about Samson. We speak a lot about Delilah and some of the characters in the story. But what can we learn about God, from this story that we read? And I know we've mentioned a few things already about the role that God plays in this story and how we relate to Him. But what can we learn about God from the story of Samson?
That he has purposes that are far beyond anything we can understand. Um, I know that if someone were to cross me like 10 times, and I know for a fact, for whatever omnipotent or whatever information I have, I know for a fact they're going to do it again and again and again and again. I'm probably not going to be on the side of that person. I'm probably not going to have a lot of patience with that person. But God, through a patience that is way beyond anything we could ever accomplish, and a purpose that's beyond our understanding, still chooses to use this guy Samson for his purpose. Um, he understood that even the wickedness and the rebellion that Samson exhibits, that he would still be of use to him. This isn't some kind of like, well, once he repented, Jesus or God started using him. I mean, this entire story, God is constantly using him in the battles that are fought and the situations that are had. Even the wife from the beginning, you can read about it in chapter 14. Even in the case of his first wife, which was a completely unlawful situation, God still uses that particular instance for his purposes. And it's interesting because that, to us, that's contradictory, right? That's something that we have trouble, well, why would God use people that are against him? Why would God use, and so it gives us this understanding of God as he controls so much more than we probably think about. And his purpose goes, as I said, much beyond our understanding.
Yeah, oftentimes he would use these countries, like the Philistines, like the Assyrians, and later on the Syrians and the Babylonians. He would use them. They were not good people. They were not kind people. They were not spiritual people, you might say. They were oftentimes very immoral in what they did, but yet God used them in order to accomplish his purpose. And so, like you said, this is kind of ties into what's going now. But we can't. Sometimes it's hard to understand. Or hard to get a grasp, like you said, of uh, the nature of God, and sometimes the true purpose that He wants. But He's someone who is well above what we know, but still He's someone who cares for us, and that's something that is pretty important. And even at the end of his story, we know that he never abandoned Samson, even though Samson gave him many reasons, ample opportunity to do so. He never abandoned him, and that is a comforting thought to think that even people like Samson, God was still there for him, and so when I look at my life, it's a comforting thought to look forward towards the future. But Andrew, do you have any closing thoughts or anything as we wrap up this story?
I mean, I think we've pretty much mentioned everything that I was going to mention. Just, keeping in mind the thought that, God can use you and no matter what situation. And also the thought that God is going to use you regardless. It's just a matter of, is he going to use you as a servant of his or an enemy of his? Because if you're an enemy of his, like the Philistines were, which funny enough, were used by God to punish the Israelites, you will receive your reckoning, even though you are being used by God. So it's your choice. Do you want that punishment or not? Because one way or another, you're going to be used by God. And so it's your choice to determine your path in that. So, yeah.
And, earlier on you mentioned, every man did what was right, in his own eyes. And I was thinking that's the very last verse in the book of Judges. It talks about that was how the state of Israel was. Every man did what was right, in his own eyes. But we know that if you're someone who does that, if you follow your own standard of righteousness, like you said, there is a time in which there is a reckoning for that. But for someone who holds true to what God has provided for us, we have a bright future to look forward to, and that's something that is very, very encouraging to think about. But Andrew, we appreciate you so much for joining us and for spending your time here with us on this Thursday night to study the story of Samson. If anyone wants to hear more about you or more about the Walcott Church of Christ, where can they go to find that?
Yes, we have a Facebook page. You just look up the Walcott Church of Christ, and it's probably going to be the first one that comes up. I don't know of any other Walcott Church of Christ that exists. Maybe there is one, but I'm pretty sure we're the only one. We have Facebook Live every morning. We don't do the whole service. We just do the sermon. That usually gets started about 10:30-ish whenever the sermon comes up. Just kind of depends on how the service goes. But any events that we have, service times, all the information to find that is there.
Well, we appreciate you being here, and we wish you the best, not only in your preaching, but also in your school as well.
Thank you very much.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that this has benefited you in some way. And like we always say, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send them our way. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of the week, and we hope that you go out and glorify God in everything that you do. And we'll see you next time.